We all have things we worry about. But when we know trouble is headed our way, we need a fighter. Someone who protects
Ontario's latest ad campaign promises the government is going to protect Ontario. But I guess that doesn't extend to protecting the sensitive data of Ontarians themselves. Because thousands of Ontario's government employees have put some of your most sensitive information, your driver's license, your credit card, your home address, social security number, your medical information, into hundreds of unsecured AI sites, which could now have shared that data just about anywhere. Ontario and Canada as a whole have rushed full steam ahead with AI tools in some of the most sensitive sectors: national defense, healthcare, policing, policymaking, and more, where AI has not only exposed Canadians to massive data breaches, but also failed to do its job in potentially dangerous ways. The kicker? Even if government employees had only used AI in exactly the ideal use case, your data would still be accessible to a foreign government who has threatened Canada's sovereignty. But hey, at least Doug Ford's phone records are safe.
That's Premier Doug Ford.
Let's get into it. Ontario started aggressively integrating AI into the government in 2023, and on paper it seemed like they were doing things the right way. In 2024, they adopted an AI strategy with goals of making the government more productive and improving services for Ontarians. They launched a code of conduct for AI with goals that AI benefits the people of Ontario, that its use is justified, that it's used in a safe and secure way, and that it is human rights affirming, transparent, and accountable. They even launched a course for government employees on the responsible use of AI. None of that really worked out, though. Ontario uses a few key AI systems in government, the main one being Microsoft Copilot. Some of these tools are very useful. There's a chatbot that allows staff to quickly find driver and vehicle transaction data, another summarizes survey results from large collections of data, another that helps staff quickly summarize laws, rules, and regulations that help them navigate red tape. All of these tools are run either by Microsoft, Amazon, or Google, a trend across Canada's government as a whole. These tools have their own problems, but the big issue here is that Ontario employees were using lots of other tools. The ministry, through Microsoft Defender, could see what tools employees were using, but never bothered to install any kind of protections to stop them from using them, which meant that between April 2025 to August 2025, 12,000 staff accessed around 400 AI websites, 244 of which were deemed unsafe or unsecure. 15% of those contained inappropriate content, and a significant number were not work-related. There were no protective measures in place to prevent staff from uploading sensitive personal or corporate data to these sites, or anyone monitoring what kind of information was being input by staff, which could then be used to train third-party large language models. So how did thousands of Ontario staff manage to be so irresponsible with AI use at work? Well, two competing things. The first is that Ontario set AI use as a KPI, meaning your performance at work was linked to how much AI you used. Yet there were no actual targets for that KPI. It was more of a vibe, an assessment of if it seemed like you were using enough AI, I guess. So employees were given the impression that AI use equals good. At the same time, only 3%, 1,800 out of 55,000 employees, had taken the responsible use of AI training course, which has been around since January 2024. Because of course, it wasn't mandatory. Despite covering the uses of Microsoft Copilot Chat, the main AI tool staff should be using, as well as Gen AI, safe use of AI websites, security issues, warning against using publicly available tools while working for the government, and more. Because only a fraction of employees were trained on how to use AI, even when they used the correct AI, Microsoft Copilot, they still did it wrong. First of all, Microsoft Copilot Chat was only used 6% of the time, compared to other Gen AI websites, despite being the mandated and most secure AI platform. Here's how it's supposed to work. Employees are supposed to use Microsoft Edge. Edge automatically logs in with a user's credentials, which enable something called enterprise data protection for Copilot. Essentially, this is a thing that companies or governments pay for, which is supposed to protect their data. It deletes prompts after a period of time, it theoretically prevents Microsoft from viewing any of the data, and it prohibits Microsoft's LLM from using the data to train itself. This is all very important. Entering sensitive information into Copilot outside of this could mean potentially exposing that information. But staff either didn't know this or didn't care, because routinely staff would use Copilot either on Chrome or Firefox, which were not set up with enterprise data protection. So, for example, if a staff member uploads a sensitive document to get Copilot to summarize it and generate some sort of response, that document may have ended up stored somewhere and being used to train an LLM. Now, why exactly is that bad? An easy way to understand it is to sub out the idea of an LLM with a person. If I give a person access to a very private document, there's a good chance they'll put it away in a drawer and no one will ever see it. But there's always a chance that the person will remember what's on it and inadvertently mention something sensitive when talking to someone else, or that the person will simply show the full document to someone. LLMs are the same way. There's always the possibility that if an LLM has been trained on a particular piece of data, it will reference or regurgitate it to someone else. And then, of course, there are more conventional data breaches. The way that Ontario has used these tools is incredibly irresponsible. But the nature of these tools and who owns them means that even in the best case scenario, they can potentially expose sensitive information. Ontario has put a lot of their AI eggs into Microsoft's basket, which is concerning but not surprising. 69.4% of external AI vendors across government are American. 2 in 5 of those are run by either Microsoft, Amazon, or Google. Canada generally has laws that important information has to be stored in Canada, part of why Doug Ford's government is quietly building data centers everywhere you look in Ontario. But does everyone remember TikTok? Remember how TikTok stored all of their US data in the US, but the US still forced them to sell to an American company because they were afraid the Chinese government could steal their data? Yeah, that wasn't just a TikTok thing. The 2018 Cloud Act gives the American government the authority to access data from anywhere in the world, as long as it's stored on a server maintained by a US company. Meaning that any data that the Ontario government put into Microsoft Copilot or Google's red tape reduction tool or Amazon's cyber control tower, even if it's stored on Canadian soil, is fair game to the American government. In 2025, a Microsoft executive testified under oath in front of the French Senate that he could not guarantee data sovereignty in the country because the US could compel them to hand over that information. Even the TikTok guy didn't say that under oath about China. In a time of frosty relations with the United States, I want to emphasize how big of a deal this is. American companies are increasingly turning to Canada and Ontario to build data centers because our electricity is cheap and our climate is colder than much of the United States. Those data centers draw enough power to run millions of homes, leading to a potential energy crisis in Ontario. The province will require 60% more energy by 2050. 13% of that is just from the 16 data centers Ontario is currently planning on building. Those data centers are then holding the sensitive data of Ontarians, the very companies that run those data centers explicitly stating they cannot guarantee its sovereignty. Away from the province's government buildings, AI tools have been widely adopted in healthcare as well, once again capturing sensitive data, but this time while also being dangerously incompetent. AI scribes have become popular in doctors' offices. Essentially, they are tools that listen to interactions with patients and take notes that previously could have taken doctors a significant amount of time to do themselves. When they work, these tools are legitimately very useful. The problem is, in Ontario at least, they don't work. Supply Ontario, who manages the province's procurement, has a list of 20 approved suppliers for AI scribes, although doctors can choose to use other vendors. An investigation by the Auditor General found that 12 of these 20 vendors recorded inaccurate information, 6 recorded incomplete information, and 9 straight up hallucinated, generating information that was never said. To clarify, that doesn't mean 8 of the vendors were fine. All 20 displayed at least one of these problems. At times, these scribes would neglect important mental health information or generate prescription recommendations that were different from what the doctor had prescribed during the consultation. Unlike in the UK, for example, doctors in Ontario are not required to verify the accuracy of the notes through a sign-off feature. This means that incorrect AI scribe notes could potentially be passed on to a pharmacist, for example, who administers the completely wrong medication, which at best could be not helpful, or at worst, could harm a patient. In this case, the problems aren't simply a lack of oversight. The entire procurement process to select these preferred vendors was deeply flawed. Vendors were not required to demonstrate their product in any way. There were no required demos or assessments. Much of the process to approve a vendor was simply based on what the vendor said about their own product. Vendors were required to submit a series of security documents, things like threat and privacy assessments, certificates of international standardization, and other certificates showing that they A, worked, and B, were not a privacy or security concern. 11 out of 20 vendors did not submit these reports, but were approved anyways. Companies simply had to say that their data was processed and stored in Canada to get approved, because nobody verified if that was actually true. Beyond that, the rubric for selecting these vendors put very little emphasis on if the product works. The largest weighted category, at 30%, is domestic presence in Ontario, followed by data privacy at 23%. Accuracy of medical notes, the thing that the scribe does, is weighted at 4%, the second lowest rating of any category. And there are no minimum score requirements per category, meaning you could score a 0 on accuracy of medical notes and system security controls and still easily be approved. Accuracy of medical notes is worth 20 possible points. The average score of the approved vendors was 12. The real problem here is bigger than potentially dangerous healthcare scribes or Ontario employees carelessly leaking some of Ontarians' most sensitive data, because it goes far beyond Ontario. Canada has entered into multi-million-dollar contracts with Palantir, led by Peter Thiel, who's a strong Trump ally, an outspoken critic of democracy, and someone who wants to create CEO-led techno-feudalist states. That contract is to manage sensitive Canadian military data. Canada spent $800 million on contracts with AI companies that will have access to data in the Department of National Defence, Veterans Affairs, Procurement and Innovation, the Canada Revenue Agency, and more. Only a fraction of the contracted companies were Canadian. Organizations like CSIS and the RCMP might be using these tools, but they won't tell us either way. Across the country, Canada is diving headfirst into using American AI companies to handle and sometimes store literally the most sensitive information in the country. This genie can't be put back into the bottle. Canada's AI strategy aims to increase business adoption of AI by nearly 5 times by 2031. Part of that plan is to develop sovereign Canadian AI companies at some point in the coming years.
Our strategy has 3 guiding principles. The first is trust. We will protect your data, your privacy, and your children. Second, opportunity. We will empower Canadian workers, Canadian businesses, Canadian students with the tools to expand their knowledge, their expertise, and their futures. And finally, sovereignty. We will reinforce Canadian sovereignty so Canadians can make their own choices on how AI is built, governed, and used.
As we've seen with the Government of Ontario, even in an ideal situation where employees are given access to what is apparently a secure environment, it is extremely easy for an employee to go outside of that and to purposefully or inadvertently upload sensitive data. All of this is done in the name of efficiency. But is it more efficient? Sometimes. The most common use of AI in the federal government is for analysis without generating content, which, if we ignore privacy concerns, does certainly help with efficiency. But the second most common use is content creation. Things like auto-generated police reports for the RCMP, or AI-generated policy documents for global affairs. In the case of Newfoundland and Labrador, they used AI to help generate their 10-year education plan, a 418-page document that took 18 months to draft. At least 15 times, the document referenced sources that don't exist. In just those 3 examples, you have AI helping to shape government policy. In one case, obviously referencing source documents that aren't real. How often do AI-generated reports across these different agencies, like AI scribes, inaccurately summarize events or outright fabricate sources? Is it truly more efficient if it doesn't work or needs to be checked over thoroughly every time it generates a report? Perhaps the most frustrating part for most Canadians is the complete lack of control when it comes to AI. Canadians were not consulted on if our data should be exposed to these companies, not even by private companies, but by the government itself. Nor were the vast majority of Canadians involved in deciding whether we wanted our farmland, green spaces, communities, and electricity to be taken up by massive foreign-owned data centers that can't even ensure our data is protected. It's no surprise that public trust in Canada's democracy is at historic lows. And while just part of a much larger whole, rapid and irresponsible adoption of AI is part of that. Mark Carney and Doug Ford continue to talk about expanding AI in this country and the economic benefits of it. But first, they need to take tangible steps to assure Canadians that our privacy and data sovereignty are more important than investments from foreign companies who have no obligation to keep our most important data safe. Thanks for watching this video. If you like this sort of content, please like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, a special thanks to everyone over at Patreon. If you want to support independent Canadian content like this, you can do so over there. The link is in the description. Thanks.